The silent threat. No one warned you about why toxic relationships are a public health crisis. Most people believe the biggest threats to their health are obvious: cancer, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, smoking, poor diet, lack of exercise. Those dangers are visible. They show up on blood tests, scans, charts, and warning labels. Doctors talk about them. Media campaigns are built around them. Entire industries exist to help you avoid them. But there is another threat, one that quietly shortens lives, weakens immune systems, accelerates aging, and fuels chronic disease, that almost no one warns you about. It doesn't come with a warning label. It doesn't show up clearly on lab work. And most people don't even realize it's happening until their body starts breaking down. That threat is a toxic, narcissistic relationship, not a bad day, not a rough patch, not the normal friction of human connection, but a relationship that keeps your nervous system in a constant state of threat. For millions of people, the most dangerous exposure in their lives isn't sugar, alcohol, or pollution. It's another human being. A partner who constantly invalidates them, a boss who humiliates and controls them, a parent who erases their emotional reality, a family system that demands silence in exchange for belonging. And here's the most shocking part. You can eat perfectly, exercise daily, meditate, sleep 8 hours a night, and still be getting sicker every year if this kind of relationship is in your life. This is why some of the healthiest-looking people you know are exhausted, inflamed, anxious, depressed, or chronically ill. And this is why some people follow every wellness rule and still don't heal. Because the body does not distinguish between physical danger and psychological danger. Threat is threat. The longest-running study on human happiness and longevity, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, found one overwhelming conclusion after more than 80 years of data. The quality of our relationships determines how long and how well we live. Strong, safe, supportive relationships extend life. What almost no one talks about is the opposite truth. Chronic exposure to invalidating, manipulative, controlling relationships can take years off your life. Not metaphorically, biologically. When you live in an environment where you are constantly bracing, watching what you say, managing someone else's moods, defending your reality, shrinking yourself to keep the peace, your body never gets the signal that it is safe. Your nervous system stays locked in survival mode. Cortisol stays elevated, inflammation rises, immune function weakens. Sleep becomes shallow, healing slows. Over time, the body begins to break down, not because it's defective, but because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do under chronic threat. And yet, as a culture, we dismiss this. We say things like, relationships are hard. Every family has issues. That's just how they are. Try not to take it personally. We normalize conditions that would be considered unacceptable in any other context. If a workplace exposed employees to a toxin that caused insomnia, anxiety, immune dysfunction, and depression, it would be shut down. But when that toxin is emotional, when it comes from a spouse, a parent, or a boss, we tell people to endure it, to be patient, to communicate better, to forgive more, to toughen up. Meanwhile, their health quietly deteriorates. Here's what makes this even more dangerous. Most people don't recognize toxic or narcissistic relationships as dangerous because the harm is slow, subtle, and confusing. There is no single catastrophic event. Instead, there is erosion. Confidence fades, energy drains, joy dulls. The body starts whispering before it starts screaming. Headaches, gut issues, autoimmune flares, chronic pain, unexplained fatigue. Doctors run tests. Results come back normal. Friends don't understand. The person begins to wonder if it's all in their head. It's not. This is not weakness. This is not oversensitivity. This is not failure. This is biology responding to prolonged psychological threat. And in the most heartbreaking part, Many people blame themselves for the damage. They think, what if I were stronger, this wouldn't affect me. They think, the other people handle this fine. They think, maybe I'm the problem. That belief keeps them trapped. Because the real danger of narcissistic and toxic relationships isn't just what they do to your body, it's how they distort your perception of reality. They make you doubt your instincts. They make you question your pain. They make you normalize the unlivable. This is why toxic relationships are not just a personal issue, they are a public health crisis. They quietly fuel chronic disease. They worsen mental health outcomes. They disproportionately harm women. They undermine healing no matter how many healthy habits someone adopts. And until we start naming this clearly, people will keep trying to heal in environments that are actively harming them. If this topic resonates with you, if something in your body tightened, or your breath changed, or a name flashed through your mind, then this series is for you. We're going to talk about what narcissism actually is, how it damages health, why it creates so much confusion, why leaving feels impossible, and how real healing begins. But before we go any further, if you value content that tells the truth about mental health, trauma, and healing, content that isn't sugar-coated, minimized, or dismissive, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to keep making deep, honest conversations like this, and it helps this message reach people who desperately need it. Now let me ask you a question. A quick question. Comment below. Which feels more true for you right now? A. You're doing everything right for your health, but something still feels deeply off. B. You've started to suspect that a relationship in your life is affecting your mental or physical health. Comment A or B below. Your answer matters, and it might be the first step toward clarity. When your body starts screaming before your mind understands the physical cost of narcissistic abuse. Long before the mind finds language for what is happening, the body already knows. This is one of the most overlooked truths about narcissistic abuse. It is first experienced not as a thought, but as a sensation. A tightening in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a fatigue that sleep does not touch. The body begins to speak long before the person understands the message. And people rarely wake up one morning and think, I am in a narcissistic relationship and it is harming my health. Instead, they say things like, I'm tired all the time. My anxiety is getting worse. I don't feel like myself anymore. I keep getting sick and no one can tell me why. This is where the story often begins, not with insight, but with symptoms. Laura noticed it in ways that felt easy to dismiss at first. She was in her early 40s, living outside Denver, active, conscientious about her health, and used to pushing through discomfort. What changed wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. She stopped waking up rested. Her muscles felt sore even on days she hadn't exercised. Her digestion became unpredictable. Her patience thinned, not because she was angry, but because she was depleted. Like many people, she blamed herself. And maybe she was doing too much, maybe it was aging, maybe stress at work. She adjusted her diet, she added supplements, she tried yoga, nothing changed. What she didn't yet recognize was that her nervous system was living under constant strain. Narcissistic abuse is not defined by occasional conflict. It is defined by chronic relational stress. The kind that never fully resolves, the kind that requires constant monitoring of another person's mood, reactions, and expectations. The kind that teaches your body to stay alert, vigilant, and braced. The human nervous system evolved to handle short bursts of danger, not endless emotional unpredictability. When threat is temporary, the body mobilizes and then returns to baseline. When threat is constant, especially interpersonal threat, the system never powers down, and this is why the body starts to break first. Under prolonged emotional stress, cortisol levels remain elevated. Over time, this disrupts immune function, increases inflammation, impairs digestion, interferes with sleep, and alters pain perception. Healing slows, Recovery stalls. The body prioritizes survival over restoration. Laura experienced this firsthand after a routine orthopedic surgery. What should have been a straightforward recovery stretched into months. Her mobility lagged, inflammation persisted, pain lingered without clear explanation. Her doctors were confused. She was compliant, motivated, and doing everything right. What no scan or lab test captured was the environment she was returning to every day. Her partner questioned her pain, minimized her fatigue, treated her need for rest as inconvenience. The conversations that should have been supportive turned into subtle interrogations. She began defending symptoms she didn't fully understand herself. The body interprets this kind of invalidation as danger. When pain is questioned, the nervous system tightens. When vulnerability is met with skepticism, the body does not relax, it contracts. Healing requires safety. Without safety, the body remains in protection mode. This is not psychological fragility. It is biology. Research consistently shows that interpersonal stress is one of the most potent stressors humans experience. Unlike work deadlines or external pressures, relational stress feels inescapable. You cannot simply turn it off. It lives in the home, in the silence, in the anticipation of the next interaction. For many people, symptoms escalate quietly. Autoimmune conditions worsen. Migraines become frequent. Skin issues flare. Heart palpitations appear. Sleep becomes fractured, not because of racing thoughts, but because the body refuses to fully rest. And then something dangerous happens. The person starts to doubt their own body. When medical tests come back normal, they are told they are fine. When symptoms persist, they are encouraged to manage stress, practice mindfulness, or consider anxiety. While these suggestions are not inherently wrong, they often miss the core issue. The source of the stress is not internal. It is relational. Laura didn't realize how much energy she was spending staying regulated around someone else. How often she was suppressing discomfort to avoid conflict. How much emotional labor was required just to get through a day without escalation. When the relationship ended, and the shift was almost immediate. Within days, her body felt different. Not suddenly perfect, but lighter, less braced. Within weeks, inflammation decreased, mobility improved, sleep deepened. Her doctors noticed the change before she fully did. This pattern is not rare. Clinicians across disciplines report the same phenomenon. When chronic relational stress is removed, health markers often improve without any other intervention. Blood pressure stabilizes, pain reduces, immune response strengthens. People feel more resilient, not because they tried harder, but because their bodies were finally allowed to rest. This is why narcissistic abuse is so often misdiagnosed or misunderstood. The symptoms span systems. They don't point to a single disease, they point to dysregulation. The body is not malfunctioning. It is responding exactly as designed. One of the cruel ironies of narcissistic abuse is that it disconnects people from their own internal signals. Over time, they learn to override hunger, fatigue, pain, and intuition to maintain relational stability. The body becomes an inconvenience rather than a guide. Healing begins when that relationship is reversed. When people start listening to their bodies, not to fix them but to understand what they have been enduring, clarity emerges. Symptoms that once felt random begin to make sense. The body was not betraying them, it was protecting them. This recognition can be destabilizing at first. It forces a reckoning with reality. It raises difficult questions about relationships that were once normalized. It challenges long-held beliefs about endurance, loyalty, and strength. But it is also deeply validating. Because when the body has been screaming for years, being heard for the first time can feel like relief. Laura often says now that her body was telling the truth long before she was ready to hear it. Not to punish her. Not to fail her. but to signal that something in her environment was incompatible with her well-being. This is the physical cost of narcissistic abuse, not weakness, not fragility, not imagined illness, but a nervous system that has carried too much for too long. And when that load is finally lifted, healing is not miraculous. It is inevitable. It's not you. Why narcissistic relationships create extreme confusion. The most haunting thing about a narcissistic relationship is not the cruelty. It is the confusion. People expect abuse to feel obvious. They imagine anger, certainty, even clarity. They think pain comes with a clean narrative. This is wrong, and I should leave. But narcissistic relationships do not work that way. They unfold in fragments, in contradictions, in moments that do not add up. This is why so many people trapped in these relationships do not say, "I am being harmed." They say, "I don't understand what's happening to me." They sit across from friends, therapists, or doctors searching for words that never quite fit. They describe feeling off balance, disoriented, unrecognizable to themselves. They say things like, "I used to be confident and now I second-guess everything," or "I can't tell what's real anymore." This confusion is not incidental. It is the defining feature of narcissistic abuse. Laura struggled with this more than anything else. Even as her health deteriorated and her body protested, she could not form a clear story about her relationship. Some days her partner was attentive, charming, even remorseful. Other days he was cold, dismissive, or subtly cruel. When she tried to talk about how these shifts affected her, the response was rarely overt hostility. Instead, it was denial. "That's not what happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're too sensitive. I was just joking." Each comment alone seemed minor. Together they dismantled her trust in her own perception. The human mind is wired to seek coherence. When events contradict each other, the brain tries to resolve the tension. In healthy relationships, inconsistency leads to conversation, repair, and understanding. In narcissistic relationships, inconsistency becomes a weapon. An affection is given and withdrawn without explanation. Apologies appear briefly, then evaporate. Promises are made, forgotten, denied. Reality shifts depending on what benefits the narcissistic person in that moment. This creates an impossible psychological environment. The person experiencing it becomes hyper-focused on meaning. They replay conversations, analyze tone, scrutinize texts. They search for the mistake they must have made to cause such dramatic shifts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the center of gravity moves. Instead of asking, "Why is this person treating me this way?" they ask, "What is wrong with me?" This is how narcissistic relationships generate extreme self-blame. Laura began to believe that if she could just communicate better, the tension would disappear. If she chose her words more carefully, stayed calmer, either asked for less or anticipated needs more accurately, harmony would return. She took responsibility not only for her own emotions but for his reactions, moods, and outbursts. This is not a failure of strength, it is a survival response. When relationships are unpredictable, the nervous system searches for control. Self-blame creates the illusion of control. If the problem is me, then I can fix it. If the problem is the relationship, then I am powerless. This is why people stay confused long after the damage is obvious. Narcissistic individuals rarely present as consistently abusive. If they did, the clarity would be undeniable. Instead, they oscillate. They create just enough warmth to keep hope alive, just enough cruelty to destabilize, and just enough denial to erase accountability. This pattern fragments reality. As people begin to distrust their memory, they question their emotions, they second-guess their instincts. Over time, this erodes something fundamental: the ability to know oneself. Laura often described feeling like she was disappearing. She could function at work. She could show up for others. But when it came to her own internal experience, she felt blurred. When asked what she needed, she hesitated. When asked how she felt, she froze. The simplest questions felt overwhelming because her internal compass had been systematically dismantled. This is why gaslighting is so destructive. Not because it convinces people of a false reality, but because it convinces them that their internal reality cannot be trusted. And without trust in one's own perception, everything becomes destabilizing. Even moments of insight are quickly swallowed by doubt, and when clarity surfaces, it is often followed by guilt. Am I being unfair? Am I overreacting? Everyone else thinks they're great, so it must be me. The social reinforcement of the narcissistic persona deepens the confusion. Many narcissistic individuals are admired publicly. They are charismatic, competent, and socially skilled. The contrast between who they are in public and who they are in private becomes another source of disorientation. If everyone else sees kindness, humor, and charm, then the person experiencing harm assumes they must be misunderstanding something. This reinforces silence. It isolates them further. Laura noticed this every time she tried to articulate her experience. Friends would say, "But he seems so supportive," or "He's always been nice to me." Each comment pushed her deeper into self-doubt. She stopped sharing. She learned to carry the confusion alone. The most devastating consequence of this dynamic is that it delays recognition. People do not leave narcissistic relationships because they are unaware of pain. They stay because they cannot make sense of it. They are not weak. They are disoriented. The turning point often comes not from a single event, but from accumulation. A quiet moment where the contradictions become too heavy to ignore. A realization that no amount of explanation ever leads to understanding. That no apology ever lasts. That the confusion itself is the constant. When Laura finally said, "It's not me," it did not feel empowering at first. It felt terrifying. Because releasing self-blame meant facing a reality she had been avoiding. The relationship was structured in a way that made clarity impossible. Understanding this was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant there was nothing she could do to fix it. Liberating because it meant she could stop trying to fix herself. This is the truth that sits at the center of narcissistic abuse. The confusion is not a flaw in the victim's thinking. It is evidence of the environment they have been living in. When someone repeatedly destabilizes your reality, confusion is the expected outcome. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, when you realize that your disorientation is not a personal failure but a relational injury, something begins to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically. But quietly, the question changes. From "What's wrong with me?" to "Why did I spend so long believing it was me?" That question is the beginning of clarity, and clarity is where healing starts, and what narcissism really is, and what it is not. Most people think they know what narcissism is. They picture someone loud, arrogant, self-obsessed, someone who talks too much, loves attention, and dominates every room. They imagine confidence taken too far, ego without restraint. That image is comforting because it feels easy to spot. But real narcissism is far more subtle, far more complex, and far more dangerous than that stereotype suggests. Narcissism is not self-love, it is not confidence. It is not ambition, success, or charisma. And it is not simply being selfish on a bad day. At its core, narcissism is a relational pattern, a way of interacting with others that is organized around entitlement, emotional dominance, and a profound inability to engage in mutuality. The narcissistic person does not enter relationships to connect, and they enter to regulate their internal world. What looks like confidence is often a shield against shame. What looks like certainty is often a defense against insecurity. What looks like strength is often rigidity. This is why so many people miss it. Laura missed it because nothing about her partner fit the caricature. He wasn't overtly cruel at first. He didn't shout constantly or announce his superiority. In fact, early on he seemed attentive, decisive, even reassuring. He knew what he wanted. He spoke with conviction. He made plans. He took up space. What Laura didn't yet see was that there was no room for her inside that space. Narcissism exists on a continuum. At one end, it looks like emotional immaturity, self-centeredness, poor frustration tolerance, limited empathy. Annoying, yes. Damaging in close relationships, often. At the far end, it becomes exploitative, manipulative, and coercive. What unites all forms of narcissism is entitlement, an unspoken belief that one's needs, feelings, and perspectives should take priority, that others should adapt, accommodate, and absorb. That disagreement is an affront, that boundaries are threats. Empathy in narcissistic individuals is not absent. It is inconsistent and conditional. It appears when it benefits them and vanishes when it doesn't. This is why people feel glimpses of connection followed by sudden emotional withdrawal. Those glimpses are not proof of safety. They are proof of capacity used selectively. Another critical misunderstanding is the belief that narcissism means someone feels good about themselves. In reality, narcissism is built on a fragile sense of self. Beneath the grandiosity, in the defensiveness and the control lies a core of unresolved shame. When that shame is activated by criticism, rejection, or even independence, it does not produce sadness or reflection. It produces anger. This is why feedback feels dangerous in narcissistic relationships. A simple request can be met with disproportionate rage. A boundary can trigger retaliation. A differing opinion can become a personal attack. Healthy personalities bend. Narcissistic personalities harden. Laura experienced this whenever she tried to assert herself. Small requests escalated quickly. Conversations derailed. The focus shifted away from the original issue and onto her tone, her timing, her supposed insensitivity. Accountability dissolved. The emotional ground moved beneath her feet. This is not poor communication. It is a power dynamic. Narcissistic relationships are not conflicts between equals. They are asymmetrical. One person seeks understanding and repair. The other seeks control and dominance. One person operates from empathy. The other from self-protection. This is why couples therapy often fails in these contexts. Traditional models assume shared responsibility and mutual goodwill. In narcissistic dynamics, those assumptions do not hold. One person is playing chess. The other is playing survival. Another dangerous myth is that narcissistic individuals are unaware of their behavior. They are not. They know how to behave when it matters. They modulate their actions around authority figures, employers, and strangers. They understand consequences. What they lack is not insight, it is accountability. And this is why the same person who humiliates a partner at home can be charming and respectful in public. The switch is not accidental, it is strategic. Laura noticed this disparity long before she could name it. His ability to be warm with others and dismissive with her created another layer of confusion. If he could show empathy elsewhere, why not with her? The answer is painful but simple. Empathy was not required to maintain power in that relationship. Understanding what narcissism is also requires understanding what it is not. It is not occasional selfishness. It is not stress-related irritability. It is not emotional clumsiness followed by genuine repair. Healthy people make mistakes, and then they take responsibility. They reflect. They apologize without conditions. They change behavior over time. Narcissistic individuals externalize blame. Apologies, if they occur, are brief and strategic. Change is promised but rarely sustained. Patterns repeat, not because the person cannot change, but because they do not believe they need to. This distinction matters deeply for healing. Laura spent years trying to fix what she believed were mutual problems. She approached conversations with humility and openness. She read books. She adjusted her expectations. She believed that if she could just find the right words, things would shift. They didn't. Not because she failed, but because she was applying healthy strategies to an unhealthy dynamic. Recognizing narcissism is not about labeling or diagnosing. It is about seeing patterns clearly. It is about understanding why certain relationships feel draining, destabilizing, even one-sided no matter how much effort you put in. When people finally understand what narcissism actually is, something profound happens. They stop personalizing the behavior. They stop searching for the perfect explanation. They stop negotiating with someone who has no interest in mutuality. This realization does not bring instant peace. It brings grief. It brings anger. It brings the collapse of illusions. But it also brings truth. And truth is the foundation of freedom. Because once you understand that narcissism is not about love, communication, or misunderstanding, but about entitlement and control, you stop asking how to fix the relationship, and you start asking a different question. What would it mean to protect myself? That question changes everything. I'm the different faces of narcissism you might be missing. One of the reasons narcissistic relationships are so difficult to identify is that narcissism does not wear a single face. Most people are taught to look for one version: the loud, arrogant, openly self-absorbed individual who dominates conversations and demands attention. When someone doesn't match that image, the possibility of narcissism is often dismissed entirely. That mistake keeps people trapped. Narcissism is not a personality costume that looks the same on everyone. It is a structure, a way of relating, and it adapts to context, environment, and opportunity. Laura didn't recognize narcissism in her life because her partner did not resemble the stereotype. He wasn't constantly bragging. He wasn't obviously cruel in public. He wasn't chasing status or attention in visible ways. And in fact, he often appeared wounded, misunderstood, even self-critical. People described him as sensitive. What Laura didn't yet understand was that narcissism can present in multiple forms, some of them quiet, some of them socially admired, and some of them hidden behind suffering. One of the most commonly missed forms is vulnerable narcissism. This is not the grandiose figure demanding applause. This is the person who feels chronically wronged by the world. They carry resentment like a badge. They speak in the language of disappointment and grievance. They often present as anxious, depressed, or overwhelmed. A vulnerable narcissist in a city like Austin might talk endlessly about how life has failed them, how opportunities never came, how other people were luckier, better connected, more supported. They pull others into a rescuer role, in quietly training them to provide emotional labor, reassurance, and resources without ever receiving reciprocity. At first, this can feel like intimacy. Being needed can feel like connection. But over time, those around them realize that nothing ever fills the void. Support is consumed, not integrated. Help is expected, not appreciated. And when limits are set, the vulnerable narcissist responds not with understanding, but with bitterness and blame. Laura encountered this dynamic when she tried to scale back how much emotional energy she gave. The response was not gratitude for what she had already offered, but accusation. She was suddenly cold, selfish, or abandoning him when he needed her most. Another form that often goes unnoticed is communal narcissism. This version hides behind goodness. These individuals are helpers, advocates, leaders, and saviors, at least in public. They build identities around morality, generosity, or service. A communal narcissist in San Francisco might be celebrated for their activism, their volunteering, or their commitment to a cause. They speak passionately about justice, compassion, and integrity. Outsiders see devotion. Those closest to them often see something else entirely. Behind closed doors, the communal narcissist can be controlling, punitive, and emotionally neglectful. Their generosity comes with strings. Their goodness must be witnessed and affirmed. When admiration fades or criticism appears, anger follows. Laura noticed how her partner's self-image depended on being seen as the good one. When she expressed hurt, it was framed as an attack on his character. Her pain became evidence of her ingratitude. The narrative flipped instantly. He was the victim, she was the problem. Then there is self-righteous narcissism, a form that thrives on moral superiority and rigid standards. These individuals often present as disciplined, hard-working, and principled. They value rules, order, and productivity. On the surface, they appear responsible and respectable. In suburban communities like those found across Ohio, this form can be especially insidious. The self-righteous narcissist believes they know the right way to live, and that deviation deserves correction. They shame others for emotional expression, vulnerability, or perceived weakness. Compassion is replaced with judgment. For children raised by self-righteous narcissists, love feels conditional. Approval must be earned through compliance. For partners, intimacy feels cold and transactional. But Laura recognized this pattern in how empathy was withheld unless she met certain expectations. Her needs were framed as failures of discipline. Her exhaustion was reframed as irresponsibility. Emotional warmth was contingent on performance. And then there is the form most people eventually recognize: grandiose narcissism. This is the confident, charming, status-oriented individual who expects admiration and deference. They often thrive in leadership roles and social hierarchies. They speak with certainty. They take up space easily. Ironically, grandiose narcissists are sometimes easier to identify because their entitlement is visible. But even here, people often underestimate the damage because charisma masks harm. What all these forms share is not style, but impact, regardless of presentation. Narcissistic individuals prioritize their own emotional regulation over the well-being of others. They externalize responsibility. They resist accountability. They experience boundaries as threats. And they organize relationships around power rather than connection. This is why Laura's experience didn't make sense for so long. She kept trying to reconcile contradictory versions of the same person, caring one moment, dismissive the next, wounded today, superior tomorrow. She thought inconsistency meant complexity. In reality, it meant instability. Another reason these different faces are missed is because people assume narcissism must be intentional cruelty. But narcissistic harm often comes from indifference, not malice. The narcissistic person does not wake up thinking about how to hurt others, and they wake up thinking about how to protect their own fragile sense of self. If someone else gets hurt in the process, that is collateral damage. This realization is painful because it dismantles hope. If harm is not caused by misunderstanding, then clarity will not fix it. If harm is not accidental, then patience will not resolve it. Laura reached this understanding slowly. It came not from a single insight, but from pattern recognition. From noticing that no matter which version of her partner showed up, her own experience remained the same. Diminished, disoriented, and emotionally unsafe. Understanding the many faces of narcissism does not require diagnosing someone. It requires listening to your own experience. It requires asking one simple question: do I feel more like myself or less when I am close to this person? And when people begin to see narcissism not as a label, but as a pattern of impact, clarity emerges. They stop arguing with appearances. They stop waiting for the real version of the person to finally stay. They understand that all the faces are real, and that realization, while sobering, is often the first moment of true self-protection. Trauma bonding. Why leaving feels impossible, even when you know it's killing you. Leaving a narcissistic relationship rarely feels like freedom at first. It feels like panic. This is one of the most misunderstood and shaming aspects of narcissistic abuse. From the outside, people ask questions that sound logical but land like knives. If it's that bad, why don't you just leave? You know they're hurting you. Why do you stay? What those questions fail to recognize is that narcissistic relationships do not bind people through love alone. They bind people through trauma bonding, a powerful neurobiological attachment created through cycles of reward and threat. Laura understood intellectually that her relationship was harming her. She could name the patterns. She could feel the toll in her body. And yet, every time she imagined leaving, her chest tightened, her heart raced, her thoughts spiraled into catastrophic scenarios. The idea of separation felt less like relief and more like danger. This contradiction is not weakness. It is conditioning. Trauma bonding forms through intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between emotional closeness and emotional pain, and the nervous system becomes trained to chase relief. Moments of kindness, remorse, or connection are not experienced as simple positives. They feel like oxygen after suffocation. The brain does not bond to consistency. It bonds to unpredictability. This is why trauma bonds are so powerful. The relationship is not all bad. If it were, clarity would come faster. Instead, there are good days that feel intoxicating. Days when the narcissistic person seems present, loving, and attuned. Days when hope resurfaces and the past pain feels exaggerated or unfair. Then the cycle repeats. Withdrawal, criticism, coldness, contempt, confusion. The nervous system swings between activation and relief, stress and calm. Over time, this pattern rewires the brain. Dopamine becomes linked not to safety but to unpredictability. And relief becomes more compelling than stability. This is why leaving feels unbearable. Laura described it as feeling physiologically tethered. She knew the relationship was damaging, yet her body reacted to the thought of separation as if she were facing extinction. She felt waves of grief for things that were never consistently real. She mourned the version of the relationship that appeared just often enough to keep her hoping. Trauma bonding thrives on fantasy. Not fantasy in the sense of delusion, but in the sense of potential. People stay bonded not to what the relationship is, but to what it could be if only one more insight landed, one more conversation worked, one more effort paid off. The narcissistic relationship becomes a slot machine. Most of the time it takes. It drains energy, self-worth, and health, but occasionally, it gives something back. A moment of warmth, an apology, a promise of change. And those moments are just enough to keep the person pulling the lever again. Laura often told herself that walking away would mean losing her investment. Years of effort, emotional labor, sacrifice. She feared that if she left, someone else might benefit from the better version of him she believed she was helping create. This belief is not naive. It is part of the trauma bond. What people do not see is that the trauma bond is reinforced not only by hope, but by fear. Narcissistic individuals often react intensely to perceived abandonment. The threat of retaliation, character assassination, emotional collapse, or financial punishment looms large. Leaving does not feel neutral. It feels dangerous. Laura's body anticipated chaos. She feared becoming the villain in a story she had spent years trying to soften. She feared the loneliness of withdrawal. She feared the loss of identity that came from disentangling her life from someone who had become the central reference point. This is why trauma bonds are often mistaken for love. But trauma bonding is not love. It is attachment formed under threat. Love expands the self. Trauma bonding contracts it. Another layer of the trauma bond is shame. Narcissistic relationships train people to believe that leaving means failure, that enduring pain is a measure of loyalty, that giving up means weakness. Many people were raised in environments where love required self-erasure. Trauma bonds feel familiar because they replicate early attachment wounds. Laura recognized this painfully late. Her tolerance for emotional instability was not random. It was learned. She had been trained to prioritize connection over safety long before she entered this relationship. Breaking a trauma bond is not an act of willpower. It is a process of nervous system recalibration. This is why advice like, just go no contact or be strong is often unhelpful. Strength is not the issue. The body must unlearn an attachment pattern built through repetition and stress. When people do leave, the aftermath can be intense. Grief arrives alongside relief. Longing coexists with clarity. The nervous system searches for the familiar rhythm of chaos. Silence can feel unbearable. Calm can feel empty. Laura experienced this when she finally created distance. She questioned her decision daily. She missed the highs as much as she feared the lows, and she wondered if she had exaggerated the harm. This is withdrawal, and like all withdrawal, it passes, but only if the person understands what they are experiencing. Trauma bonds weaken when reality is consistently reinforced, when patterns are named, when support replaces isolation, when the nervous system experiences safety without volatility. This is why education matters. Naming the trauma bond removes shame. It explains why intelligent, capable people stay in harmful relationships. It reframes the struggle not as a moral failure, but as a biological response. Laura didn't break the trauma bond by forcing herself to stop caring. She broke it by understanding what had been happening to her, by recognizing that her panic was not a sign she should stay, but a sign of how deeply the relationship had conditioned her. In leaving did not feel brave at first, it felt terrifying. But over time, as her body settled and her mind cleared, something changed. The urgency faded, the cravings quieted, the bond loosened. Not because she tried harder, but because the threat was finally gone. Trauma bonding explains why leaving feels impossible, even when you know the relationship is killing you. And understanding it is often the first step toward freedom. How narcissistic abuse rewrites your identity. Narcissistic abuse rarely announces itself by destroying a person outright. It works more quietly than that. It reshapes identity by degrees through small concessions that seem reasonable in the moment. A softened opinion here, a silenced reaction there, a preference abandoned, a need postponed. Over time, the person does not feel attacked. They feel edited. This is how narcissistic abuse rewrites who you are. Laura did not notice the shift all at once. She didn't wake up one day feeling erased. Instead, she noticed absences. She laughed less. She spoke more cautiously. She stopped sharing ideas that once came naturally. When asked what she wanted, she paused, not because she was undecided, but because the question felt unfamiliar. That pause is not trivial. It is the sound of an identity being overwritten. In narcissistic relationships, the self is not attacked directly, it is crowded out. The narcissistic person's emotions take up so much space that there is little room left for anyone else's inner life. Needs become negotiations, feelings become inconveniences, boundaries become provocations. The message, repeated subtly and relentlessly, is simple. Your inner world is less important than mine. Over time, the person on the receiving end adapts. Not consciously, not strategically, but instinctively. The nervous system learns that expressing certain thoughts leads to conflict, withdrawal, or punishment. So those thoughts are buried, emotions that once surfaced freely begin to go underground. Laura learned this slowly. She became skilled at reading moods, anticipating reactions, and preemptively minimizing herself. She told herself she was being considerate, mature, flexible. What she was actually doing was surviving. Identity erosion in narcissistic abuse often looks like compliance, but it is driven by fear. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of emotional rupture, fear of abandonment, fear of escalation, fear of being seen as difficult or ungrateful. Each act of self-suppression reinforces the pattern. I won't bring this up, it's not worth the argument. I'll let it go, it's probably not that important. I don't need that, it's fine. These are not neutral choices, they are withdrawals from the self. One of the most devastating aspects of narcissistic abuse is how it distorts self-concept. People begin to define themselves not by who they are, but by how well they manage the relationship. Success becomes measured in calm days. Failure becomes measured in conflict. Laura began to believe she was inherently demanding, too emotional, too sensitive, not because those things were true, but because every attempt at authenticity was met with dismissal or ridicule. Over time, she internalized the narrative that harmony required her to be smaller. This is not personal pathology, it is conditioning. For those who grew up in narcissistic or emotionally invalidating families, this pattern feels eerily familiar. Early survival required attunement to others' needs at the expense of one's own. Love was conditional, expression was risky, silence was safety. Narcissistic relationships exploit this early wiring. The adult self becomes trapped in a childhood strategy. Minimize to belong. Laura recognized this when she began to notice how little access she had to her own preferences. Simple questions felt overwhelming. What do you want for dinner? What do you want to do this weekend? What do you need right now? She didn't know. Not because she lacked opinions, but because she had learned not to consult them. Identity erosion also shows up in the body. People describe feeling numb, disconnected, or hollow. And they say things like, I feel like a shell of who I used to be, or I don't recognize myself anymore. This is not depression in the traditional sense, it is dislocation. The self has been displaced. Narcissistic abuse also fragments identity by forcing constant role shifts. One moment the person is idealized, the next devalued. One moment they are needed, the next resented. The instability prevents a coherent self from forming. Who you are depends on the narcissistic person's mood. Laura found herself constantly recalibrating. She became whatever was least likely to provoke tension in that moment. Over time, this eroded her sense of continuity. She felt different versions of herself existed, none of them fully real. This fragmentation is deeply destabilizing. A stable identity requires reflection, mirroring, and validation. And in healthy relationships, people see themselves through another's consistent regard. In narcissistic relationships, mirroring is distorted. Validation is conditional. Reflection is replaced with projection. The narcissistic person does not see you as you are. They see you as a function. When you serve their needs, you are good. When you don't, you are the problem. Laura realized how deeply this had affected her when she left the relationship and found herself alone. Without someone else's emotional gravity pulling her into orbit, she felt untethered. The silence was not peaceful at first. It was disorienting. Who was she without the role she had been playing? This stage of healing is often frightening. People expect relief. Instead, they encounter emptiness. The self that was suppressed does not immediately reappear. It has to be rebuilt. And this is why narcissistic abuse recovery is not just about leaving. It is about reclaiming authorship over one's identity. The process is slow and deeply personal. It begins with noticing small things, preferences, reactions, desires, discomfort. It involves allowing emotions to surface without immediate judgment. It means learning to tolerate being seen, even by oneself. Laura's healing began not with big revelations, but with quiet choices. She noticed what music she liked without commentary. She paid attention to how her body felt in different environments. She allowed herself to say no without explanation. Each act felt foreign at first. Each one was a step back toward herself. The most painful realization for many survivors is not that they were harmed, but that they were changed. Grief emerges for the self that was lost, delayed, or distorted. This grief is real. It deserves space. But there is another truth that often comes later. Identity can be rebuilt, not into who you were before, but into someone more grounded, more self-directed, and more whole. The self that emerges after narcissistic abuse is often quieter but stronger, less performative, more deliberate. Laura did not return to who she used to be. She became someone new, someone who no longer needed permission to exist. Understanding how narcissistic abuse rewrites identity is not meant to create despair. It is meant to restore compassion for the adaptations you made, for the silence you chose, for the self you protected in the only ways you knew how. You did not disappear, you adapted, and adaptation, once understood, can be undone. That is where recovery truly begins. Can a narcissist change? And the truth, most people don't want to hear this, is the question people ask in a whisper. Not because they don't know the answer, but because they are afraid of it. Can a narcissist change? It is usually asked late at night after another painful conversation, after another apology that felt rehearsed, after another promise that sounded sincere but oddly hollow. It is asked by people who are exhausted, confused, and still holding on to hope, not because hope feels good anymore, but because letting go feels unbearable. Laura asked this question for years. She asked it silently while watching small moments of softness appear and disappear. She asked it every time her partner said, "I'll do better," or "I didn't realize how much that hurt you," or "things will be different now." Each statement landed like a life raft. Each one reignited the belief that if she just stayed long enough, loved clearly enough, or explained gently enough, something fundamental would shift. This question is not foolish. It is human. Because we are wired to believe that insight leads to growth, that pain leads to reflection, that love motivates change. But narcissistic personality structures do not operate on those principles. Change requires three things: insight, accountability, and sustained motivation. Not briefly, not performatively, but consistently, especially when it is uncomfortable. This is where the truth becomes difficult to hear. Most narcissistic individuals do not change in meaningful, lasting ways, not because they cannot, but because they do not experience their behavior as the problem. They experience other people as the problem. Narcissistic patterns are organized around externalization. When something goes wrong, responsibility is projected outward. Blame lands on circumstances, partners, co-workers, stress, childhood, or misunderstanding. Even moments of apparent insight often dissolve once discomfort sets in. Laura noticed this pattern clearly in hindsight. When her partner expressed remorse, it was often tied to an immediate consequence: conflict, distance, or the threat of loss. The apology was not rooted in empathy for her experience. It was rooted in a desire to restore equilibrium. Once stability returned, so did the old patterns. This is not accidental. Narcissistic personalities are rigid. They are structured to defend against shame at all costs. True change requires tolerating shame without converting it into anger, blame, or control. And that capacity is profoundly limited in narcissism. This is why therapy rarely produces transformation unless the narcissistic person is internally motivated, and that motivation is rare. Most narcissistic individuals enter therapy not to change themselves, but to manage external crises. A breakup, a job loss, a reputational threat. They seek relief, not restructuring. When therapy challenges their behavior, it often triggers defensiveness. When accountability is suggested, they feel attacked. When empathy is required, they disengage. This is not a failure of therapy. It is a mismatch between the demands of growth and the narcissistic defense system. Laura spent years believing that her partner's intelligence meant he could change. He was articulate, reflective when it suited him, insightful about others' flaws. She assumed these traits would eventually turn inward. They didn't. Because insight without accountability is not growth, it is strategy. Another painful misconception is the belief that love can heal narcissism. Love does not heal entitlement. Sacrifice does not cure control. Patience does not dismantle rigidity. In fact, excessive empathy often makes narcissistic patterns worse. The more one person absorbs blame and adapts, the less pressure there is for the narcissistic person to reflect. Laura realized this only after she stopped explaining herself. When she withdrew emotional labor, the dynamic did not soften. It escalated. The loss of supply exposed the structure underneath. This is often the moment when people finally understand the answer to the question they've been avoiding. And if someone only behaves well when they are getting what they want, that is not change. It is compliance. True change shows up when it costs something, when no one is watching, when power is relinquished, when responsibility is taken without resentment. Laura never saw that. What she saw instead were cycles: remorse, reassurance, regression. Moments of self-awareness followed by denial. Promises followed by repetition. Each cycle deepened her exhaustion and eroded her hope. This is why clinging to the idea that a narcissist will change can be so damaging. It keeps people investing in a future that is structurally incompatible with reality. It delays grief. It postpones self-protection. Letting go of this hope is one of the most painful steps in healing, not because it means giving up on the other person, but because it means confronting the limits of what love can do. This realization does not require vilifying the narcissistic person. Many narcissistic individuals are deeply wounded. Many experienced invalidation, neglect, or overvaluation in childhood. Their defenses once served a purpose, but explanation is not obligation. Laura reached a moment of clarity when she asked herself a different question. Not can he change, but what am I giving up by waiting for him to? The answer was devastating. Her health, her sense of self, her emotional safety, her future. Change, if it ever comes for a narcissistic person, must be internally driven and externally supported over years, not weeks. It cannot be coerced, negotiated, or earned by another person's suffering. This is why the most compassionate act for both parties is often acceptance. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means seeing reality without distortion. It means releasing the fantasy that if you just endure a little longer, something fundamental will shift. Laura did not leave because she stopped caring. She left because she finally understood that waiting for change was costing her everything. The truth most people don't want to hear is this: you cannot heal someone who does not believe they are the problem. You cannot love someone into accountability. You cannot sacrifice yourself into their growth. What you can do is choose clarity over hope that harms. You can choose yourself without cruelty. You can stop measuring your worth by someone else's capacity to change. That is not giving up, that is waking up, and for many survivors, it is the moment their life finally begins. Stay or leave, and both paths have a cost. Here's the real calculation. This is the moment almost everyone dreads. Not because it's unclear, but because it is too clear. Stay or leave. People often talk about this decision as if one option is obviously right and the other is obviously wrong, as if staying means weakness and leaving means strength, as if clarity immediately produces action. That is not how real life works. Laura reached this crossroads long after she understood the nature of the relationship. She knew the patterns. She no longer blamed herself. She could see the harm clearly. And yet, the decision did not simplify, because both staying and leaving carried a cost. This is the truth most people don't want to admit. There is no painless option in a narcissistic relationship. Staying has a cost. Leaving has a cost. And the question is not which path is easy. The question is which cost you are already paying, and which one you are willing to keep paying. When people talk about staying, they often minimize what it requires. They frame it as endurance, compromise, or loyalty. But staying in a narcissistic relationship is not passive. It demands constant adaptation, emotional suppression, strategic silence, relentless self-monitoring. The cost of staying is cumulative. It shows up in health, in sleep, in chronic stress, in the slow erosion of identity, in the loss of future possibilities that never fully materialize because so much energy is spent managing the present. Laura began to see this clearly when she imagined her life 5 years forward, not in crisis, not in catastrophe, but exactly as it was, the same arguments, the same confusion, as the same emotional isolation. Nothing dramatic, just unchanged. That image terrified her more than the idea of leaving. Staying also carries an invisible cost, the normalization of harm. Over time, people adapt so thoroughly that the abnormal becomes routine. What once felt intolerable becomes familiar. Expectations shrink. Dreams are postponed indefinitely. Laura realized she had stopped asking herself what she wanted her life to look like. She was too busy figuring out how to survive it. But leaving is not the fairy tale people imagine either. Leaving a narcissistic relationship is rarely met with quiet acceptance. Narcissistic individuals experience separation as a threat to identity, control, and narrative. When someone leaves, especially on their own terms, it destabilizes the narcissistic structure, and the response can be swift and punishing. Smear campaigns, legal battles, financial retaliation, emotional manipulation, attempts to rewrite history. Laura feared this deeply, and with good reason. She had seen how quickly her partner could shift from charm to cruelty when control was challenged. Leaving did not feel like walking away. It felt like stepping into a storm. There was also grief, not just grief for the relationship, but for the version of herself she had imagined within it, for the future she had hoped to build, for the belief that love and effort would eventually be enough. Leaving meant confronting loss without the comfort of illusion. This is why many people stay longer than they intend. Not because they don't understand the harm, but because they are calculating risk. Especially when children, finances, cultural expectations, or health issues are involved. Laura wrestled with this calculation daily. She asked herself whether she could protect her health while staying, whether she could maintain boundaries without provoking retaliation, whether partial disengagement could be enough. For some people, staying is a temporary strategy, not a surrender but a preparation. Gathering resources, building support, strengthening autonomy, planning carefully. This is not failure, it is realism. The most dangerous mistake people make at this crossroads is rushing themselves toward a decision without fully understanding the costs. External pressure from friends, family, or cultural narratives often ignores the complexity of narcissistic dynamics. Just leave sounds empowering until you're the one facing the consequences. Laura needed time to understand what staying would truly require. Radical emotional detachment, limited engagement, acceptance that the relationship would never provide safety, validation, or growth. The loss of intimacy, not just temporarily, but permanently. She also needed to understand what leaving would demand: resilience, support, legal and financial preparation, emotional fortitude during post-separation fallout. Neither path was clean. But one truth became unavoidable. Staying required sacrificing her inner life. Leaving required confronting external chaos. Over time, Laura realized she had been taught to prioritize harmony over self-preservation, to choose stability over safety, to endure quietly rather than disrupt openly. The decision shifted when she reframed the question. Not, can I survive staying, but what kind of person will I become if I do? She saw how staying required ongoing self-erasure, how it demanded she keep shrinking to maintain peace, how it placed her health, autonomy, and future permanently on hold. Leaving, while terrifying, did not require her to disappear. It required her to stand. This is the real calculation. Staying costs you slowly. Leaving costs you sharply. Staying drains you quietly. Leaving challenges you loudly. Neither path is painless, but only one path allows for recovery. Laura did not leave impulsively. She left with clarity. She left knowing the storm was coming. She left because she understood that staying was not neutral. It was a choice with consequences she could no longer accept. And for those who choose to stay, whether temporarily or long-term, the work is different but equally demanding. It requires radical acceptance, emotional boundaries, external sources of support, and the courage to stop expecting the relationship to become something it will never be. This chapter is not about telling anyone what to do. It is about telling the truth. There is no version of this decision that doesn't cost something, but there is a version that allows you to keep yourself, and that is the calculation that ultimately matters. The healing begins with radical acceptance. Healing does not begin with strength. It begins with acceptance, the kind most people resist because it feels like defeat. Radical acceptance is one of the most misunderstood concepts in recovery from narcissistic abuse. Many people hear the word acceptance and assume it means approval, forgiveness, or surrender. They imagine it asks them to excuse harm, minimize pain, or make peace with injustice. That is not what radical acceptance is. Radical acceptance is the moment you stop arguing with reality. For Laura, this moment did not arrive gently. It came after she had already seen the patterns, understood the damage, and made decisions she once believed she would never make. And yet, even then, part of her mind kept reaching backward, searching for a loophole, an exception, a version of the story where things could still turn out differently. This is where many people get stuck. They leave or emotionally detach or set boundaries. But they do not accept. They continue negotiating with the past. They replay conversations. They imagine alternative outcomes. And they wait for closure that never comes. Hope lingers not as comfort but as an open wound. Radical acceptance closes that wound, not by pretending it didn't hurt, but by acknowledging fully and without distortion what is and what is not. Laura's healing began when she allowed herself to say something she had been avoiding for years. This relationship will never give me what I needed. Not might not. Not if only. Never. That sentence did not bring peace immediately. It brought grief. Radical acceptance is inseparable from grief because it requires letting go of the future you were promised, imagined, or worked for. It means mourning not just the person, but the life you thought would unfold if you tried hard enough. Laura grieved the version of herself she had been striving to become within that relationship. The calmer version. The more patient version. The version who could finally relax once everything stabilized. Acceptance meant acknowledging that stability was never coming. This kind of grief is often invisible to others. There is no funeral for unrealized futures, no ritual for the self that never got to exist. But the pain is real and it deserves to be honored. Many people resist radical acceptance because they confuse it with giving up power. In reality, acceptance is the moment power returns. As long as you are trying to change someone who has shown you they will not change, your energy is locked outside yourself. Your nervous system remains oriented toward monitoring, predicting, and managing someone else's behavior. Acceptance redirects that energy inward. Laura noticed this shift gradually, when she stopped waiting for apologies that meant nothing, and her mind grew quieter. When she stopped explaining herself to someone committed to misunderstanding her, her body felt less tense. When she stopped hoping for repair that never lasted, something unexpected happened. She had space to feel sadness without panic, space to rest without guilt, space to notice what her body actually needed. Radical acceptance also requires accepting uncomfortable truths about yourself, not in a shaming way, but in an honest one. Laura had to accept that she stayed longer than she wished she had, that she ignored signs she now saw clearly, that she tolerated harm she would never condone for someone else. This acceptance was not self-condemnation, it was compassion grounded in reality. She understood that she did not stay because she was weak. She stayed because she was bonded, hopeful, conditioned, and human. Acceptance allowed her to stop rewriting her own history as failure. Another painful aspect of radical acceptance is accepting that there will be no satisfying ending. Narcissistic relationships rarely conclude with accountability, remorse, or mutual understanding. There is no final conversation that ties everything together. No moment where the other person suddenly sees the harm they caused and makes it right. Waiting for that moment delays healing indefinitely. Laura realized that closure was something she would have to give herself, not by forgetting but by deciding that understanding no longer required the other person's participation. Acceptance also means accepting limits. Limits to what you can fix, limits to what you can explain, limits to how much clarity another person is willing to tolerate. And these limits are not personal failures, they are structural realities. When Laura accepted these limits, her focus shifted from why to what now. This question marks the true beginning of healing. Radical acceptance does not erase pain. It changes your relationship to it. Pain becomes something you move through, not something you argue with. You stop reopening wounds by insisting reality should have been different. Instead, you build a life that accounts for what actually happened. This stage of healing can feel strangely quiet. Without the constant emotional noise of the relationship, the nervous system begins to downshift. At first, this quiet can feel unsettling. Many people mistake it for emptiness or depression. It is neither. It is decompression. Laura learned to tolerate this quiet slowly, and she allowed herself to grieve without rushing to meaning. She resisted the urge to turn pain into lessons too quickly. She let sadness exist without framing it as a problem to solve. This patience was radical for someone who had spent years managing chaos. Acceptance also brought anger, not explosive anger, but clear anger. Anger that said, "That wasn't okay," without immediately softening it. Anger that did not need to be acted out to be valid. This, too, was healing. Radical acceptance does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop bargaining with harm. It means you stop sacrificing yourself in exchange for the fantasy of peace. For Laura, acceptance became the ground she stood on. Not a destination, but a foundation. From that ground, grief moved, anger clarified, strength returned, not as force, but as steadiness. And this is why healing begins with radical acceptance. Because nothing can be rebuilt on denial. Not identity, not safety, not joy. Acceptance is the moment you stop asking reality to change and start changing how you live within it. It is not the end of the story. It is the moment the story finally becomes yours. Rebuilding the self after narcissistic trauma. Rebuilding the self after narcissistic trauma does not happen all at once. It happens quietly in moments so small they almost feel insignificant. Until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who once disappeared to survive. For Laura, the end of the relationship did not immediately bring a sense of wholeness. What it brought was space. And at first that space felt unsettling. Without the constant emotional gravity of someone else's needs, expectations, and reactions, she felt unmoored. There was no longer a role to play, no mood to manage, no tension to anticipate. The question that echoed most often was not, "What do I do now?" but "Who am I now?" Narcissistic trauma does not just injure a person, it reorganizes them. For years, identity has been shaped around adaptation, around minimizing conflict, around predicting someone else's emotional weather. When that structure falls away, there is often a strange emptiness where the self should be. This emptiness is not a failure to heal. It is the starting point. Rebuilding the self begins with something deceptively simple: listening inward. But for survivors of narcissistic abuse, this is anything but simple. Many have been trained, explicitly or implicitly, not to trust their own signals. Hunger was inconvenient. Fatigue was weakness. Discomfort was overreaction. Desire was selfishness. Laura noticed how disconnected she was from her own internal cues. She could tell you what others needed instantly, but struggled to answer basic questions about herself. What do you want? What do you enjoy? What feels good right now? At first, she answered out of habit what sounded reasonable, productive, or socially acceptable. But slowly, she began to pause, to wait for a sensation instead of a script. This pause was the beginning of self-reclamation. Healing after narcissistic trauma is not about becoming louder or harder. It is about becoming more real. That process often looks quiet from the outside. It involves paying attention to what drains you and what restores you. It means allowing preferences to exist without justification. Laura began noticing how her body responded to different environments. Some places left her tense for hours afterward. Others felt grounding. She started choosing the latter, not because they made sense on paper, but because her body relaxed there. This was new. Rebuilding the self also involves grieving who you were not allowed to be. Many survivors rush past this step, eager to move on or prove resilience. But ungrieved loss does not disappear. It hardens. Laura grieved the years she spent doubting herself. She grieved the version of herself that spoke freely. She grieved the time and energy she gave away in the hope of stability. These griefs surfaced unexpectedly in waves, triggered by moments that reminded her of what had been postponed. She learned not to rush them. Grief, when allowed, makes room for authenticity. It clears space where the self can return. Another critical part of rebuilding identity is relearning boundaries, not as walls, but as information. Boundaries tell us where we end and others begin. In narcissistic relationships, boundaries are routinely violated, mocked, or punished. Survivors often internalize the belief that having limits is dangerous. Laura felt this when she began asserting small boundaries, declining invitations, taking time alone, saying no, without explanation. Each act triggered a familiar anxiety, a reflexive fear of backlash that no longer came. With repetition, her nervous system learned a new lesson. Safety did not require self-erasure. This is how identity heals, not through insight alone, but through lived experience that contradicts old conditioning. Yet rebuilding the self also requires patience with inconsistency. Some days Laura felt grounded and clear. Other days old doubts resurfaced. She questioned herself. She felt guilt for prioritizing her needs. She wondered if she was becoming selfish. These moments did not mean regression, they meant integration. Trauma recovery is not linear, it is cyclical. Each cycle brings more awareness, more choice, and less self-abandonment. One of the most profound shifts Laura experienced was the return of curiosity. For a long time, her inner life had been dominated by vigilance. What would happen next? How could she prevent conflict? How could she maintain stability? As that vigilance softened, curiosity took its place. She became interested in what she liked, not what was expected, what she believed, not what would keep the peace, what felt meaningful, not what looked impressive. This curiosity was not dramatic. It showed up in small explorations, reading without interruption, walking without destination, letting herself enjoy things without turning them into achievements. These were not indulgences, they were acts of repair. Rebuilding the self also involves redefining strength. In narcissistic dynamics, strength often means endurance, tolerance, emotional containment. Survivors are praised for how much they can carry. Healing reframes strength as responsiveness, as knowing when to rest, when to stop, when to choose differently. Laura learned that she did not need to prove resilience anymore. She could build a life that did not require constant resilience. One of the quiet milestones in her healing was realizing she no longer felt the need to explain herself. Not because she didn't care what others thought, but because her internal sense of validity had returned. This is what a rebuilt self looks like. Not perfection, not constant confidence, but an inner reference point that no longer depends on someone else's approval. Over time, Laura noticed that her relationships began to change. Not because she was trying to attract something different, but because she was no longer available for dynamics that required self-sacrifice. Her tolerance for emotional confusion diminished. Her capacity for mutuality expanded. This was not learned through theory. It was learned through embodiment. Rebuilding the self after narcissistic trauma is not about becoming who you were before. That person survived under constraint. The self that emerges after healing is often quieter, more discerning, and more grounded. Yet less eager to please, less willing to explain, more committed to truth than harmony. Laura did not find herself in the way people often describe. She built herself, carefully, patiently, and with compassion for every version of who she had been. This is the final truth survivors often discover. The self was never destroyed. It was protected. And when the threat is gone, protection can soften into presence. That is what rebuilding the self really means. Not reclaiming a past identity, but creating a future one that no longer requires disappearance to survive. The most powerful health decision you'll ever make. The most powerful health decision you will ever make is not found on a nutrition label, in a fitness app, or inside a doctor's office. It is the decision about who has access to your life. For years, Laura believed health was something external. She followed the rules. She ate carefully, exercised consistently, kept her appointments, did everything she was told a responsible adult should do. And yet her body continued to carry a quiet exhaustion that no supplement or routine could touch. What finally changed her health was not a new habit. It was a choice. The choice to stop living in constant emotional threat. This is the part of the health conversation we rarely have. We talk endlessly about optimization, biohacking, longevity, peak performance. We measure steps, calories, sleep cycles, but we almost never talk about the invisible factor that overrides all of it, whether your nervous system feels safe in your everyday life. Your body is not a machine that can be optimized while it is under attack, and emotional threat counts as attack. The human nervous system evolved for survival, not convenience. When it senses danger, especially danger that is interpersonal and inescapable, It reallocates resources, healing is deprioritized, digestion becomes irregular, immune function shifts, inflammation rises, sleep fragments. Over time, this state becomes baseline. Laura did not realize how long her body had been living in survival mode until it didn't have to anymore. After she left the relationship, there was no dramatic overnight transformation. What came first was quiet, deep sleep, a slower heartbeat, a sense of internal spaciousness she could not remember ever feeling before. This was her body exhaling. What most people do not understand is that the body keeps score of relational environments. It remembers who makes you tense, who makes you shrink, who requires you to perform emotional labor just to maintain peace. Every interaction sends a signal, safe or unsafe, and those signals accumulate. You cannot meditate your way out of a chronically unsafe relational environment. You cannot supplement your way out. You cannot positive think your way out. If your nervous system is constantly bracing for criticism, dismissal, or emotional volatility, your health will pay the price. This is not because you are weak. It is because you are human. Laura began to see her past health struggles differently, not as personal failures, but as adaptive responses. Her body had been doing its job, keeping her alert, ready, prepared to respond to threat. The problem was that the threat never ended. The most powerful health decision she made was not leaving the relationship itself, and it was believing that her well-being mattered enough to leave. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because society often rewards endurance over discernment. We admire people who stick it out, who sacrifice, who tolerate. We frame suffering as strength. But the body does not interpret chronic endurance as virtue. It interprets it as danger. Choosing who you allow into your life and how close they get is not selfish. It is preventative medicine. It is nervous system care. It is a form of self-respect that ripples outward into every aspect of physical and mental health. Laura noticed that once her nervous system settled, other changes followed naturally. Her energy returned without effort. Her immune system stabilized. Her motivation became intrinsic rather than fear-driven. So she did not have to force herself into healthy behaviors. They emerged organically once survival mode lifted. This is the part no one tells you. When you remove the source of chronic stress, the body often knows exactly how to heal. Not instantly, not perfectly, but steadily. The decision to limit or remove toxic relationships is rarely framed as a health intervention. But in reality, it may be the most impactful one available. It determines whether your body spends its days repairing or defending. It determines whether rest is restorative or shallow. It determines whether joy feels safe or fleeting. Laura did not become invincible after making this choice. She still faced stress, uncertainty, and loss. But those experiences no longer piled on top of a constant background of emotional threat. Her system had capacity again. And this is the difference between stress that comes and goes and stress that lives inside you. One builds resilience, the other erodes it. The most powerful health decision you will ever make is deciding that you do not need to earn peace by suffering. That love does not require self-erasure, that connection should not cost you your vitality. This decision does not always mean leaving immediately. Sometimes it means distance. Sometimes it means boundaries. Sometimes it means redefining expectations. Sometimes it means building parallel sources of support so that no single relationship holds all the power. What matters is clarity. Clarity that your health is not negotiable. Clarity that relationships are not neutral to the body. Clarity that safety is not a luxury. It is a biological necessity. And Laura often reflects on how different her life feels now. Not louder, not more impressive, but calmer, more rooted, more alive. She did not gain years by adding more to her life. She gained them by removing what was slowly taking them away. If there is one truth to carry forward, it is this: your body will always tell the truth about your relationships. Listen to it. Because the people you allow close to you will either help your nervous system settle or keep it locked in survival. And that choice, more than any other, shapes how long and how well you live. Laura's story is not dramatic in the way movies portray transformation. There was no single explosive moment, no villain exposed under bright lights, no instant victory. In what makes her story powerful is precisely how ordinary it is, and how many people quietly live a version of it every day. For years, Laura believed her exhaustion was her fault. She believed her confusion meant she wasn't trying hard enough. She believed her body's breakdowns were personal weaknesses to be corrected, managed, or pushed through. Like so many others, she internalized the message that resilience meant endurance, that loyalty meant tolerance, and that love required self-sacrifice, even when that sacrifice came at the cost of her health. What she did not understand at first was that her body was not malfunctioning. It was responding. Responding to an environment where safety was inconsistent, where emotional ground shifted without warning, where connection came with conditions, and where her nervous system never fully rested because it was always waiting for the next emotional impact. As the years passed, Laura slowly lost touch with herself. Her preferences faded, her confidence eroded, her world narrowed to managing another person's moods, expectations, and reactions. She became skilled at surviving, but survival is not the same as living. The turning point did not come from learning new coping skills or gaining more insight into narcissism. It came from a deeper realization. Nothing she did could make the environment safe because the danger was relational, not behavioral. The confusion was not a failure of intelligence, it was a symptom of trauma. The exhaustion was not laziness, it was chronic stress. Once Laura stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "And what am I living inside of?" everything changed. Her healing did not begin with leaving, it began with clarity. Clarity that what she was experiencing had a name. Clarity that love was not supposed to feel like constant self-doubt. Clarity that her body deserved peace, not perpetual vigilance. From there, her choices became less reactive and more intentional. She learned where to place boundaries, where to limit access, and where to stop explaining herself. She stopped offering her most vulnerable parts to people who had proven they could not handle them with care. Slowly, her nervous system began to settle, and as it did, her health followed. The lesson in Laura's story is not that leaving is easy or that every situation has a clean resolution. The lesson is this: your body is always telling you the truth about your relationships, even when your mind has been trained to doubt itself. You cannot heal in an environment that requires you to disappear. You cannot thrive while constantly bracing for impact. And you cannot build a healthy life on top of chronic emotional threat. Applying this lesson to your own life does not require drastic action overnight. It starts with listening. Paying attention to how your body feels around certain people. Noticing where you tense, where you shrink, where you feel drained after every interaction. It means questioning narratives that tell you to tolerate harm for the sake of appearances, obligation, or hope that has already cost you too much. It also means offering yourself compassion for what you didn't know before. Many people stay because they are loyal, empathetic, and hopeful, qualities that are strengths in healthy relationships. Those qualities only become liabilities when they are exploited. Healing begins when you stop negotiating your worth for connection. Laura's story reminds us that the most meaningful transformations are often quiet. They look like peace instead of chaos, clarity instead of confusion, a body that finally feels safe enough to rest. And that is not weakness, that is wisdom. Quick question for you. Which do you believe is more damaging to long-term health? A. Poor lifestyle habits like diet and lack of exercise. B. Long-term exposure to toxic or narcissistic relationships. Comment A or B below and let us know why you chose it. We'd also love to hear your perspective. Have you ever noticed your health, energy, or sense of self change because of a relationship? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel to support more honest, healing-focused content like this. Your support helps us continue creating videos that tell the truths many people are living but rarely hear spoken out loud.